So last week, I ended the message wondering, imagining how Jesus would teach this message of God's love to a group of people, maybe something assembled like this, gathered around in these days and times. Rather than teaching them to give and pray in secret, that was a theme throughout there, without expectations of public favor or opinion, today he might say, put your ego, your personality, that one who wants to be acknowledged and recognized in your being, into the passenger seat and let the higher self move into the driver's seat, that seat of wisdom, that being that can be compassionate even in the midst of challenges. Jesus' teachings, especially those core teachings that we found in the Sermon on the Mount that we explored earlier this summer, were an invitation to those listening to examine what was most important to them, what were their values, and to describe for them the values that will bring about that kingdom of heaven, that heavenly realm from which to live and move and have our being. In all of his teachings, he emphasized humility and compassion, perseverance and peace, service, generosity, kindness, trust. He might say, if he was standing here talking to us today, that the kingdom of heaven is behaving with wisdom and compassion while maintaining inner peace, regardless of what the external circumstances are. That's the very definition of spiritual intelligence, at least as defined by Cindy Wigglesworth in her book, SQ 21. The practices that she brings into our awareness, our willingness to engage with, the measurements, are the same core tenets that Jesus taught. Our ability to behave with humility, with kindness towards ourselves and others, to awaken and to follow a light that is not seen from the external world, but that arises from within us, with trust, with perseverance. And ultimately, in the midst of all this, to discover a peace, as it was described in the scriptures, that passes all understanding, a peace that shows up because that's the place that we have evolved into, worked into, strived to be as part of our everyday being. Jesus would end most of his teachings with this statement. He would say, those who have eyes see, those who have ears hear. Today, we might call it self-awareness. Those awarenesses of that ability to see and listen to both the capital S higher self and the small s little self, or the ego. So self-awareness is a skill set that calls us to expand and to evolve our ability in being aware within ourselves, awareness of our own worldview, awareness of our life's purpose, awareness of our values and the hierarchy of those values. What's most important to us? What comes next? So that when we're making decisions, those become the measuring stick, the guidance of which way we go. The ability to have complexity in our inner thoughts, and this awareness that there are actually two selves, two beings, two minds, two guidance systems going on within our being. Last week, we talked about cultivating our awareness of these two selves, these two voices. I don't know how many of you that were here could identify with having this conversation, sometimes even an argument in our own mind. They used to demonstrate it as, you'd have the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder, and they were both whispering in your ear which direction you should go. But this is part of our awakening, that there is a wisdom within us. There is also that part that is centered on what's going to make us the happiest in this moment, what's going to help us to feel safe and secure, because that's the ego's job, is to give us that sense of safety and security. But when we can put that ego, the smaller self, into the passenger seat, just have it be there to navigate us. It's an important part, we need it. But not have it be driving the car, and allow that higher self of wisdom to step into that role, helps us navigate in a different way, helps us navigate from a different vantage point, perspective, if you will. She uses this as a measuring stick before we act, before we say something, do something, and it's this. When I can be in this state of self-awareness, then nothing I would say or do would embarrass me if it were posted online. Sometimes from that anonymity of being online, that little self can say things, do things. I witness it. That's why I don't get on there very often. Because even the most loving, beautiful people that I know, other Unity ministers, it's a good thing that it's a private group. And we're all human beings, and we get to express sometimes from that little self, but I really use that. Would I say this to the person's face? Would I act this way if they were standing right in front of me and not in some remote cloud? From a brain science perspective, the ego is highly connected to the oldest part of our brain. It is that limbic system, which is, again, primarily concerned with keeping us safe, keeping us alive. And it gets triggered whenever fear shows up, whenever there's a perceived threat. The limbic brain takes over. And when that happens, it literally lowers our IQ and our EQ, our intellectual and emotional intelligence. Those are managed in another part of the brain. When this one takes over, everything else goes dark. And we are just responding and reacting out of that place. We've all had moments, well, I know I have, I'm thinking you probably will agree, when we have reacted in a way that we wouldn't normally react. When we've said something or done something because the trigger came, and before this part had any chance to think about it, out of our mouth came, and I'm not going to say a response, because that's typically responses I think about coming from our big neocortex. Reactions come out of our limbic system. It's quick. I describe it, and I used to tell board members this, after about 8 p.m., my filters get lowered. And I am likely to say, and we used to have late board meetings, and if they went on much past 8:30 or 9 o'clock, I knew I was going to say something that I was going to then have to go back and write my apology email to them because it's just, and I know that about me, when it gets tired, those filters are hard to keep in place. That part of me that can say, breathe, you let go, let me sit with this for a minute before I react and respond to that. Because the higher self occupies a different space. It's in our prefrontal cortex, especially this forebrain, which makes up about 40% of our brain. So it's a big part of our space. And when we're in that space, when we can be seated in that space, we have a much greater capacity to stay wise, to stay calm, to stay centered in the midst of whatever might be happening around us. So expanding our self-awareness asks us to see and to pay attention to where we are in that moment, and as often as we can, when we're aware, try and bring us back to that space in which at least I want to occupy as often as I can. It also, this whole self-awareness skill set asks us to understand our worldview, and more than just understanding our own worldview, recognizing that others have a worldview, and it may be just as valid, albeit very different from our own. It is our each unique framework of beliefs and values and ideas and culture. It is the lens that we interpret the world through. I've used spiral dynamics in the past. That's a big, broad worldview over the evolution of human history. There's things like, and you can go Google that if you're not familiar with it. There is so much information out there that you can get about it. But things like the Myers-Briggs test or the Enneagram, which kind of gives us our own personality types, can help us to realize that other people may process and engage with information in very different ways. The author talks about that big aha moment for her. She took the Myers-Briggs test, and she's an introvert, and she could see how others on her team who process things, she said, I like to process things quietly, to think them through, before I would speak about it. She said there were others in the teams that I worked on that liked to just throw a lot of half-baked ideas and build upon one another and just do it all out there externally. And she used to have some pretty strong judgments about the people that process that way. They just didn't get the better way to process information. And I'm sure they had opinions about the way she processed things as she stayed quiet until she felt like she was at a space to share. It wasn't that one was worse or better than the other, it's just different. And we have different ways all around this globe in which we process information. So self-awareness is just first being awake to the fact that, yes, that can be true. Not just, this is the way I process things, so thereby that's the way the rest of the world, it's the right way, because it's the way I process it. I do want to say about this, though, that I watched this documentary. It was called Persona. I think it's on HBO. And it was about how in today's modern technology, there are companies taking the things like the Myers-Briggs. I never had to do this, but some of you may have. If you go, especially large corporations, you have to take a personality test as part of your job hiring application. And then they would use these to determine I've learned to, I can have a certain view and I can have strong feelings about that view, but self-awareness starts to say, in my opinion, from my perspective, not that it is the God-given truth for everybody, but it is the way I can see and understand and experience and express the world. And because of that, part of self-awareness is also our ability to hold complexity of thought. We live in a really complex world now. We do. And our ability that we need to be able to hold these two seemingly opposing thoughts at the same time expands our own self